Hey there everyone, and a very happy Thursday to you today. Today I want to share with you a really fun and easy way to use your embossing powders with your stencils to create a raised dimensional background. So this is the card project that we're going to look at today. You can see this kind of bubble pattern background has been embossed. When I tilt that, you can see the shine on there, and if you could feel it, you'd feel that there's a bit of texture on here as well. Well, this has been done with embossing powder and with a stencil. Now, as I tilt this, I think you can probably also see there's some embossing on this area here too, as well as my little cutout embellishment. So I'll talk a little bit about that and about the clear embossing powder that I use for that technique. So if you're ready, I'm going to stand up and tilt you down and we can get started on our embossing. So hang in there with me while I do the technical part and get you so that you can see my work surface. Okay, so let me arrange this a little bit more. So once again, we'll take a look at that background pattern first of all. Now this is using a stencil from Paper Artsy. The stencil is filthy, my apologies. It does need a good scrub. As you can see, I've used it with some paint as well. But this is the Eclectica PS102, or what I call the squashy dots stencil. It's a nice all-over design and it's perfect for creating backgrounds like this. Now we're going to talk about this technique in terms of backgrounds, but of course if you have a stencil that's got a single image like a leaf or something, you can do the same technique as well. So it's not just for backgrounds, although I think it has a really cool wow effect when you use it that way. So the embossing powder that I'm using is from Wow, and this is the Sunburst. This is one of 3 in the Bursting with Colors trio that I did for Wow. So that's also got Berry Burst and it has Lava Burst in there as well. So I'm going to be using this. Now the unique thing about this embossing powder, if I tilt it a little, you can see that there's not just orange, there's not just yellow, but there's a blend of these. And all of these embossing powders that I've done recently for Wow have a yellow or a gold in them, which means that when you just put them down on your background, that you'll get a variegated effect. So this is just a brayered background and that embossing powder added on there. Now the ink that I'm working with, of course, also from Wow, it's the embossing ink. It's clear, which it's supposed to be. And this is going to be how I hold my embossing powder onto my cardstock. I've had a lot of questions about basic embossing lately, so I'm going to cover those as well as we're going into this. So I'm going to start with a piece of smooth white cardstock, and I'm just going to grab my filthy stencil and pop this down. Now, the other things I want to have on hand right away, I have a folded piece of scrap paper, and that's going to catch my excess embossing powder. I'll have my embossing powder jar on hand as well, and I've got my ink pad. So what I'm going to do is just take this embossing ink pad. I'm going to hold down my stencil. If you really wanted to, you could also secure it down with some masking tape or washi tape, but I'm just going to hold this down for now. And I'm pressing the embossing ink through the stencil. I'm not squashing it, but I'm also not doing a really light tap. It needs to go through that stencil. So you need to be pretty firm. And I go around it a couple of times. I also like to turn the embossing ink pad so that I don't end up with a rectangular shape of ink. Okay, so got that on here, put the lid on, and I'll lift this up, and because it's clear ink, you can't really see it. You can see it in person, but it's a bit tricky this way. But just wait until I've got my embossing powder on here. So what I'm going to do is just start at one end and add some on here and then kind of let that fall off. You won't waste any embossing powder because you're going to put it right back into the jar, so you can be as generous as you want to. And then you can see where that embossing powder has stuck in the wet ink areas where that stencil has been. And you can also see that there's some variation in the color of the embossing powder as well. So now what I'll do, set that aside, and because I've got my piece of scrap paper folded, I can just funnel this right back into the jar, and then nothing goes to waste. And I hang on to these pieces of scrap paper, so I'll use this for the same color again. So pop the lid back on there. And then what I can do is heat set. So this is the tool that I use to heat set my embossing powder with. This is also from WOW. It's called a heat tool or a heat gun. The important thing to keep in mind with this tool is that you've got the air vents going along the base here, and it's just really important that when you're holding this, you don't cover those vents with your hand. This heat tool has two heat speeds, regular and then super. And you can use them interchangeably. So what I'm going to do is just emboss this a tiny bit, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like when it's all done. Okay, I'm not going to emboss the entire piece because as my daughter pointed out, that's really boring to watch. But I wanted you to see that it will begin to melt. You can see where that's a bit raised and shiny. It's still quite hot because the heat tool does get really hot. So you want to let it cool before you handle it. And then when you're done, you'll have a piece that looks like this. So you've got some shine, you've got texture, you have a really cool pattern on here. And the fun thing about this is that it doesn't have to be completely perfect because you've got a really fun abstract background. So if there are some areas that I can see where I got a little bit too much ink through my stencil, that's also fine too. I think it just creates a really fun and shiny tactile background. And so you can see that's what I've used here. Now for the strip that's going across the center of my card, that's actually the same embossing powder color. I've taken my embossing ink pad, and instead of pressing it through a stencil, I've just pressed the ink directly onto my cardstock, added some of the embossing powder on there, and then heat set that, and that gives me a really fun background strip here. So that's what I've used to just glue across the center. Now, when I went to create the card and I just put this down on here, I thought it needs to have a little bit of something to kind of go in between, set some contrast on there, which is why I mounted it onto a strip of black cardstock. So that just gives a little bit of definition there. So the stamp set that I'm working with is also from Paper Artsy, like the stencil. And this is the Eclectica ESN 26. So I've got this fun big sentiment here, which I think is perfect for graduation season, or maybe somebody starting a new job. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing at all. And then I've also got this big element here, but I've only used a portion of it. So you can see I've only used those wings. They were actually leaves, but they kind of look like wings. And I've stamped the image twice so that I could get two wings that are the same shape, and then one that's kind of got that peaky little end bit to it. And I've also got on here these two elements, a little postmark. And that's just to create a collage. So I've cut apart the large collage image and only used the wings, and then added these two bits here. Now there is some shine to those wings and to the focal element here. And to do that, what I've done is simply stamped them. So I've got here, for example, is that postmark. I cut it out, stamped it with black onto white cardstock, and I cut it out, leaving a little sort of handle on here. And then what I'll do is, again, get in another piece of scrap paper. And for this, I'm using the Clear Gloss Superfine from WOW. Now, I've got a big jar of this. Normally, WOW embossing powders come in the little jar. This is the big one, and it is available in this size. And this is because you will use it a ton if you're anything like me. So what I do here, grab this, hold it down with my finger, take that embossing ink pad, and then just apply the ink directly on here. And add some of the embossing powder just into that wet ink as we did before. And tap that off. Now you can't see it because of course it's clear, but let me show you in a second. Again, putting back my excess embossing powder. And you'll notice I didn't use the folded sheet that I used with my orange embossing powder because I've still got a little bit of residue in there, and I don't want to dump it back into this jar because then it will get some kind of contaminating particles in there. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is heat set this. And you can see that I have a shiny image. Now you can do this and create layers and layers of that clear embossing powder on there, and I do that often. I'll just let this cool, add more ink, add another round of embossing powder, or even while this is still hot, you can add more embossing powder straight away on top. But this gives you almost like an enamel sort of image, and it just adds another nice layer of texture and dimension onto your card. So that's what I've done, not only with the rectangular postmark, but also the round one, and then also the leaf accents on here so that I could just create sort of my own collage around here. And that's one thing to keep in mind with any of my stamps. I always try and give you collaged images, but those that you can also kind of cut apart and create your own collage as well. Now I've got my sentiment up here on some foam tape just so that I've got a little bit of room with the layering on here. And I added these elements up with some foam tape as well. These ones too, so that I've got some layers. I think you can see that as I've got that on here. And this is just a really quick and easy way to not only combine your embossing, but also to put your stencils to another good use and to create a fun and easy and kind of exciting background, I think, as well. Now this also looks really pretty. Of course, we're showing it with colors, but you could also do a white on white or a clear on white with that very same stencil, and it would give you a completely different effect. So lots of different options that you can do with this, but I think it is a technique that's a great one to have in your back pocket for your embossing and stenciling. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you again not next week because I'm going to be traveling next Thursday, but the week after that. And in between, I'm going to have lots of other videos and blog posts for you too. So I will not leave you stranded without card making and stamping ideas, but I will see you next week. I hope you have a fantastic weekend and take good care.